You see, the problem with the Congo was that when I started that book, Congo was not one of the key countries. But over time, then actually Congo became a problem. And then I thought if I could include the Congo, and I had already had Uganda, I had Rwanda, I had Burundi, and I had Sudan, the book would be actually too big. And then I also didn't know whether that conflict was going to end. Because if you remember from my book, I said even Sudan gave me a problem because I didn't even know. Because this book was finished in 2005. I was just lucky that the mediation in Sudan had been concluded in 2005 and I had the CPA. So the problem with the Congo is that at that point it was not very clear. Although the Pretoria peace agreement had been signed in 2002, and the parties were implementing, in fact, the agreement itself, and they were waiting for the elections in 2006. But I wasn't really prepared at that point when I finished in 2005 to actually begin to revisit the Congo process. However, I think I should let you know that I've written some chapters on mediation of conflicts in East Africa where I've included the DRC from the time the Kabila 1 and Kabila 2 through the Lusaka process, the SADC, and the UN. So actually I have done some work on the Pretoria Peace Agreement that led to peace in the Congo. Yeah, it is very complicated, but it also just borrows from the same ideas that I have in the book, which is how do you actually coordinate local and international, but also regional mediators. And I think the key element about the Congo is that once the South Africans, through SADC, became the lead authors of the agreement, it was much easier for the other actors to actually come about much more easily, because you needed leadership of a major power within the region. If you remember from the beginning, the mediator in the DRC was Ketumile Masire from Botswana. And he had a lot of problems from the outset. People are saying, he doesn't speak any French, he's very quiet, and he can't lead the Congolese parties to any agreement. And then the UN came in, and then the UN started to appoint their own Mustafa Niasse and so on. But it was at the time when South Africans, through Mbeki, had actually said, this is our conflict, and we are going to own it because the DRC is part of SADC. But we also need to help Mr. Masire, and we need to coordinate between Masire and the UN and the AU so that we actually have a much more credible process. You'll also remember that the problem in the DRC was that you had the Gabonese actually trying to come in and trying to mediate the conflict. But the Gabonese, it was not very clear what the Gabonese were actually doing in that conflict. Exactly. So in fact, in the articles that I wrote on the DRC, I said Bongo and Gaddafi were examples of meddlers because they come into these conflicts. They don't really bring much to the table, but they want to be seen to be part of the game. So that's actually the complication in the DRC. Fortunately, I think the South Africans produced the Pretoria Agreement, which was a very good agreement for the Congolese. Yeah, and I think it still remains a good agreement, which also shows the coalescence of regional, international, and African actors in conflict resolution. The causes of the conflicts in the Great Lakes region stemmed first from governments that were very insular, governments that actually didn't have a stake in the people. So that's why the generalization about Central Africa stems from the kind of Mobutu kind of leadership, big state, but a leadership that was very insulated. So, and this can be generalized across the board. I mean, we saw this in Rwanda under the Habyarimanas and so on. This is a general trend of insular leadership. The state is not part of society. And so the point we are making in this book is that to what extent as we talk about reconstructing nations, because these nations also collapsed, these states collapsed because of part of the problem of insularity, militarization, and so on. So one way to restore these societies, these countries, was to go back to the old notion about state and society relations. Leadership is about bringing those two components together. And that is why we're saying through negotiated agreements, like the Lusaka peace agreement that said in the DRC, external actors should not be in the Congo. But also agreements like the Arusha agreements on Burundi, the Arusha agreements on Rwanda. These are agreements that were saying, how do we begin to do things differently in rebuilding our states? We cannot build a state without taking account into local communities. How do we engage local communities into peace-building processes? But how do you build on local communities so that you're actually building stable societies? Because the complaint in the book was societies are collapsing as states are also collapsing. And so in the reconstruction, you need to do two things together. You need to have stable states, but you also have stable and more comfortable communities. And that, we argued, the agenda was therefore for reconstruction of governments, functional ones, but we also needed to reconstruct militaries, because militaries are going to provide order. But down the road, you also have to construct societies, communities. You have to create mechanisms where these communities are going to negotiate grievances amongst themselves. And we see this very clearly in the Eastern DRC, where the conflict has continued because really there is no dialogue among the major parties in those regions. So reconstruction of societies, reconstruction of communities was a project that we are proposing should be actually central to the peace and reconstruction process. And then you remember there are agreements like the Amani agreement.
Absolutely.
In the Kibus. That was actually, it came out after the book came out. But what we are suggesting in the book is that you need those kinds of Amani agreements that are going to be the mechanisms for reconstructing societies from below, not from Kinshasa. Kinshasa was going to have some role, but primarily Amani was about how do you get the Eastern together, yes. It's a dilemma that we saw not just in DRC, we saw this dilemma in Burundi. I mean, the protracted negotiations in Burundi, in Arusha, had too many parties at the table. And people are saying, why should you have more than 19 parties trying to negotiate an agreement that should be negotiated by probably the main three parties? But the argument was, if you begin to leave out some parties, they begin to become spoilers. So the dilemma is that actually the more parties you have, the more protracted the negotiations become. But the few parties you have at the table, the more you alienate some of the elements. So the balance is therefore is who is more credible? What is the most credible route? I believe in the more comprehensive, more inclusive process of negotiation. So the Amani process was not flawed because there were too many parties. I think the Amani process was flawed because those parties really did not trust each other. And I think you had the civilians, you had the militaries, you had the militias who didn't trust each other. But also some of the militias also were not at the table. The former Interahamwe were not there, and nobody wanted them at the table. It was also very difficult to bring their supporters to the table because nobody knows who their supporters is, and very few people would have wanted to say, these are our supporters. The argument was, these are just militias who are running around within the neighborhoods, and these are negative forces.
Absolutely.
And therefore they could not be part of the Amani process. Yeah, so I think they needed to be included at the table just as much as you had people like Nkunda's forces who are not really genuinely Congolese also included on the table. So the Amani, I'm saying, I think the framework was really was a good framework, but you had too many parties who didn't trust each other, and you had some of the more important actors not really around the table. But the other problem is that process should have been continued. You could not have an Amani that you only have in January and then it ends, and then you begin to believe that an agreement actually can be sustainable. I think you needed ongoing negotiations within those parties, and that's probably something that the UN failed to do, or the governments, the two governments, the DRC and Rwanda, failed to do. That you needed a sustained peace-building process after the Amani.
Absolutely.
Peace cannot just be an event.
Absolutely.
It has to be a process. I was invited with a few colleagues of mine to help the Panel of the Wise, which is an institution within the Peace and Security Council, really to help them think through some of the big issues in Africa. And the Panel of the Wise was instituted the same year that there was electoral violence in Kenya in 2007, 2007 in fact. So the Peace and Security Council decided that as part of the capacity building for the mediation of the Panel of the Wise, which should be advising the AU Peace and Security Council to begin studies about conflict areas in Africa. So we did a big report with my friends Habele Matlosa and Nuruddin Idris on preempting and preventing electoral violence in Africa. This was a report that was completed in 2010. We started actually working on it around 2008. So it was completed. 2010 is important because the AU heads of states approved this report. What does the report do? It just simply says these are ways in which Africa can build a capacity for preventing electoral violence. And so we go through how to build credible electoral management bodies, how African leaders, especially the AU, especially the AU Panel of the Wise, can intervene preemptively in conflict around elections. So we suggested, for instance, each year the Panel of the Wise should draw up a roster of all the countries in Africa that are going to hold elections. We know that elections are very contentious, but if they draw up a list every year, then they can decide which ones actually look like they are going to be problematic. And then you start a diplomatic engagement with local actors, with the election management bodies, with political parties, with the government about, we suspect that these elections are going to be problematic. How can we help you prevent it? So that's what we did. And the report was published also in 2010. And it's one of the good reports about African engagement proactively in conflict prevention. The very same year, we were asked by the panel also to do a big report on Africa's responses to issues of impunity. This report is much more contentious because what it said, I wrote it with a friend of mine who works in Nairobi with the ICG International Crisis Group. Her name is Comfort Error, and it's called on Impunity, Conflict Prevention and National Reconciliation in Africa. What this report has suggested is that Africa is an important player in the debates about the International Criminal Court. African countries were the authors of the ICC, and Africa has made a significant contribution to international legality, particularly the promotion of human rights, the prevention of impunity. And so we suggested in the report that the Panel of the Wise should advise African countries not to be in a big battle with the ICC. They should invite the prosecutor of the ICC, Mr. Ocampo, to set up an office in Addis Ababa. We know that there are conflicts between some African countries and the ICC, but we suggested that the best way to do it is for the Panel of the Wise to counsel Africa that Africa benefits in the long run if they adhere to some of the provisions of the ICC. But the second issue we mentioned was African countries have actually referred cases to the ICC. So they can't blame the ICC for bringing out these issues. So we were telling the panel of the wise that this is what you should do. This report was adopted by the panel of the wise last year in Algeria. We had a meeting there where the discussion was this should be adopted as the beginning of the adoption by the AU heads of states. Of course, I don't know whether that is going to happen. The panel has accepted it. It has sent it to the AU Peace and Security Council. AU Peace and Security Council is studying the report. If they approve it, then they will send it to the AU heads of state. I don't believe at this point that there is consensus in Africa about the ICC. But what we are trying to do was to actually forge that kind of consensus. The third report, I'm not involved in it, but it's about women and wars. Women, Children and Wars in Africa. It is co-authored by my Nigerian friend Comfort Ero, who is with ICG in Nairobi, with other people. So I'm not involved in that. But I was asked this year in April by the AU panel of the wise, and I was asked to do another report for them. And this is a report on the impact of North African uprisings on the provision of unconstitutional change of government in Africa. There is an AU provision that says an unconstitutional change of government through uprisings, through military coups, is actually legal. So the question is that the panel of the wise wanted me to advise them on how are we going to deal with Libya, Egypt, and Tunisia now that this provision is still on the books. So I just finished this report, and I'm presenting it in Addis Ababa on the 3rd of December. There's going to be a group of people who've been invited by the panel of the wise. They look at my report, they read it, and then they see whether, in fact, that is the correct line to take. Because what I've said in the report is that North African uprisings are not inconsistent with the AU provision on unconstitutional change of government. I mean, technically they are not, because these are uprisings against illegitimate governments. The AU has been promoting good governance and democratization since the 90s. Egypt was not a democracy. Tunisia was not a democracy. Libya was not a democracy. So the very fact that people have stood up to overthrow these regimes is not a bad thing. However, I suggest that the panel of the wise should also lead the revision of that unconstitutional change in government provision. So I've suggested in my report that there are things that need to be ironed out in that provision. It's called the Lome Agreement of 1999 on unconstitutional changes of government. So hopefully when we meet in Addis Ababa in December, I'll present this report to them and then I can get input. But it is actually simply to say African leaders should begin to realign some of the protocols with the realities on the ground. And the reality is that you have mass uprisings. If they are legitimate, they should be accommodated. I just came from Helsinki actually about 2 weeks ago. So let me explain what CMI is trying to do here at the AU. The first thing it's doing is helping in the implementation of the AU panel report on election violence. So we held a meeting in Addis Ababa in April where CMI is actually helping the Peace and Security Council to implement some of the provisions of this report. As I mentioned, the report says we need a roster of elections coming up. We need to anticipate conflicts in Africa. So that's the big part of what CMI is doing. But the second part is that CMI is involved in creating a secretariat for the panel of the wise. And this is a secretariat that is going to play a role in the mediation of African conflict. Because the panel of the wise are elders who are supposed to have this moral responsibility on African conflict resolution. But you see, they can't do it without the resources. They can't do it without a big secretariat, because the secretariat of the panel of the wise is now only 3 people. So CMI is planning to actually use some of its resources to create a core of mediators within the AU, so that these are the people who can not just advise the panel of the wise, but they can also be deployed abroad. And so it's doing a big roster of African mediation capacity. They are looking all over Africa to see who are the people, not the elders, not the big people, the much more technical. How can we actually build a capacity of African mediators by identifying critical people? When we were in Helsinki, one of the issues that came to the table, or the proposals that we tried to make to CMI, is that they should in fact build a training institute, establish a training institute of mediators in Addis Ababa. And this is an institute that is going to be important, because what it's going to do is to pull in some of the people from the AU who don't have a lot of training in mediation, but who are routinely engaged in mediation. So we suggested that it would be a good way to spend their money to actually identify young people within the Secretariat to be trained in mediation. Secondly, they could also identify people from African embassies who are diplomats, but they don't have a lot of their skills in mediation. These are the people who can actually then begin to build a mediation. So I think CMI is planning to do a much more sustained engagement in training and capacity building for African mediators. And I think they're planning to set up an institute. If they set up the Institute of Mediation in Addis Ababa, I think this will be an important element, because there are some organizations now that are actually beginning to do that within the context of the University of Addis Ababa and so on. Institutes like Institute of Security Studies in Pretoria is actually doing some of that. So the more training institutes we have, the better, because we cannot be short of mediators. We need them, and I think that's what CMI has been trying to do, and build the capacity of the Secretariat, really. Yeah, the official link is that the AU Panel of the Wise is an institution within the AU Peace and Security Council. So it's actually supposed to advise the chair of the AU via the Security Council, or the Security Council through the chair of the commission. So Mr. One is just part of that architecture, I think, because they are not the Panel of the Wise doesn't work for anybody else. It actually works for the AU Peace and Security Council. So down the road, the advice filters into the Peace and Security Council. But this should also be important in actually African conflict management mechanisms as a whole. So the emphasis is, if you build a good capacity within the AU Panel of the Wise, that's one way of actually building Africa's broader security architecture. Because right now, I mean, the Peace and Security Council is doing too much. I mean, there are a lot of conflicts that they have to deal with, but they also need an institution within it that reflects more broadly on these issues, and that's why they created the AU Panel of the Wise as an institution that advises gently and kindly to the chair, and Mr. Wane is actually an important component of that. Let me start by saying the trend that has occurred over the last few years, just to pick up on the discussion about the AU Panel of the Wise, is that these sub-region organizations like ECOWAS, the East African Community, and COMESA have established their own Council of the Wise. They call them the different names, but it is the same thing. What they are trying to do is to replicate and emulate what is being done at the AU level. So the Council of Elders in East Africa are these very prominent people who should be deployed when conflicts occur, who should be the mediators within sub-regions. There is criticism emerging, however, that we need more or better coordination between the Council of Elders at COMESA the Council of the Wise at ECOWAS, and all this proliferation of mediation institutions with essentially the panel of the Wise. And I think that's a bigger problem of coordination of these initiatives. So my response to you is that at the level of mediation, maybe the more the better, even though we need to be very clear that we are not competing, that the elders are not competing amongst themselves. On your larger issue about the role of regional institutions in Africa began to take on security roles in the 90s. That is at the time when Nigeria began to use ECOWAS to intervene in Liberia and Sierra Leone. Subsequently, these security roles have actually grown, as we've seen in SADC, going into Lesotho, intervening in Lesotho in 94, in 98. We've seen it in IGAD, intervening in places like Sudan through the peace process, the Sudanese peace process, but also IGAD trying to restore peace in Somalia. The issue here is who actually has a comparative advantage when it comes to issues of conflict resolution. Is it the AU or is it sub-region organizations? And I think the way to answer that question is to say there are institutions like ECOWAS now that are in the peace building and peacemaking process that you can't get them out. I mean, ECOWAS was very instrumental in the mobilization of the unanimity in Cote d'Ivoire. They came out very clearly in early December last year to say Mr. Gbagbo has lost the election. And therefore, as a sub-region, we want this to be the voice that actually carries the day. So regional institutions are actually playing very important fire brigade roles. They're strong in some cases, but they're also weak in some cases. I have suggested that in places like the Horn of Africa, you don't really need an institution like IGAD, because what has happened is that once it brought peace to Sudan, it has not done much else. And IGAD is actually not meeting that much because Eritrea and Ethiopia are not talking to each other. Even right now, the Kenyans are threatening the Eritreans. They are saying, we are going to break diplomatic relations with you because you are funding Al-Shabaab. And Kenya, you remember, just recently intervened in Somalia. So my point has been, you need to begin to refigure African sub-regional security institutions. And let me also remind you that South Sudan has applied for membership in the East African Community. As soon as they applied, Northern Sudan also applied. And so that means there is no real interest in IGAD as an institution. So my point has been, and I made this point in 2009 at the Chatham House in London, I said IGAD should be abolished because most of what it does can be done by NGOs, early warning, just trying to find out very basic things. So what that means is that then we should focus on reconstituting the real African sub-region organizations that make sense. So ECOWAS still has an important role. Now that there have been changes in Libya, there should be moves to reconstitute the Arab Maghreb Union. Because the Arab Maghreb Union was actually set up, or potentially this is going to be the sub-regional institutions within North Africa that deals with North African issues. The Arab Maghreb Union hasn't done much because the Moroccans and the Algerians don't speak to each other. And then, of course, you had the problem of Libya and so on. So anyway, now it's a good opportunity for Africa to begin to re-engineer this sub-region organization. I think the East African community is doing very well, although it hasn't really been faced with real security challenges it has to deal with. Maybe it should begin thinking of dealing with the piracy issue, because Tanzania and Uganda are actually affected, Tanzania and Kenya are affected by it. Southern Africa has done very well. And I think we've seen SADC intervening in Zimbabwe. Some people have criticized how slow that process is. Some people have criticized the quality of the agreement. But I think SADC is doing well. Just recently they produced the Madagascar agreement. And now we are going to see whether that agreement is going to be implemented. So I'm saying that there are sub-regional institutions that have critical roles to play in security. I would also say there are institutions that also need to die natural death, like SENSAD. And I don't know whether you know SENSAD. SENSAD was an institution that Gaddafi created because he wanted to challenge the AMU, the Arab Maghreb Union. And Gaddafi was essentially funding SENSAD. So I don't see SENSAD existing beyond this year. But I'm also troubled by the fact that institutions like COMESA are also into security, because I think COMESA should really be into trade and market integration rather than becoming, a peace building or peacekeeping institution. So we need to rationalize. We need to say the comparative advantage of COMESA is to enhance trade in Africa, probably not to be in conflict resolution, because a lot of COMESA members are also members of other institutions. Absolutely. Like SADC or IGAD or the East African Community. Egypt is a member of COMESA, and Egypt is very far away.